Welcome to my video review of good occult movies that I recommend to you. I wanted to do this because I got so much love for a video I did almost 10 years ago now. I can't believe it. The rare, obscure, and forgotten films video that I did. I couldn't have imagined it get so many views, but I've done one of these for pagan films and for witchy films. And I realized some of the themes got very distinct between or from pagan, occult, and witchy stuff. And I can't believe I haven't talked about some of these yet with you. So we should start with what occultism is and what it is not. Most people seem to use it synonymously with the black arts, the weird devil stuff. You know what I'm talking about. But of course the word means hidden, or that which is hidden. It is also defined as beyond the bounds of ordinary knowledge. And the verb form means to cut off from the uninitiated. So occultism in human works, particularly the arts, it both conceals and reveals, often concealing by revealing, and often the other way around too. This is why anything related to sight we refer to as ocular. Did you hear my cat back there? I've got one in here, one out there. You're probably going to hear him again. Now it feels like there's recently a kind of quiet or subdued resurrection of occult understanding and conveyance in film that I've noticed over the last couple of years. I was not expecting this at all. It is equally surprising and refreshing. I've noticed that a particular production company I can almost always count on for quality, thoughtful, unique, and creative films from a production company called A24. They have almost never let me down. There's a couple of things that I thought were just acceptable, but most are really good. One of them, I just had a very good feeling about when seeing the trailer. And I remember I watched it again 3 or 4 times that day, and I just decided I'm just going to take a chance and buy this on DVD, the 4K Blu-ray. And, you know, sometimes you just get that feeling, and I followed through on that, ordered it, arrived, and wow, did that ever pay off. So, let's start right there with that one. The Green Knight. I unabashedly call this one of the most beautiful films ever made. It gives me hope for the future of filmmaking and is the main inspiration and instigation for creating this video. In the middle of the movie, there's a full 360-degree pan, which is key and compass to understanding all the combined themes together. Cycles. The movie begins with the winter solstice celebration, whereupon our title character proposes meeting again in 1 year. Cycle of the seasons, cycle of driving karma, reaping what we sow, allowing ourselves to be challenged to become more than what we are at present. The Queen's tarot cards resemble the German hunting decks of the time, and there are animals in this deck which are themed in the movie. For each of the 3 days that our title character stays as a guest in the castle with the king and the queen, a different animal is hunted each day with the king, each of which the Green Knight otherwise meets. This all is as perfect a representation of the ancient mysteries as cinema can possibly produce. Now, I recommend not going to watch videos on YouTube with people claiming to explain what happens in this movie. The story is intended to be a mysterious experience. Just absorb it patiently, and I suggest not in the presence of people who need to hear themselves speaking frequently. Watch it with a calm mind, or even when you're looking to have a calm mind. I'm sure many viewers are disappointed they're not being given a fast-paced action flick here, with clear-cut good guys and bad guys, and that's okay. They'll know what they're in for long before the halfway mark and drop out by then. But if you're watching this video and are familiar with the Ariadne's thread of subject matter that I deal with, you will be far from disappointed with this one. You do not have to have read the book before seeing this, but I do suggest doing so. Unbeknownst to those who were bored with this movie, and sort of ironically, the book upon which this was based, written by a sadly unknown author, is actually very fast-paced, especially when compared with most other medieval stories of Grail lore. And on that note, I should mention that the most occult-laden Arthurian works of that time which stand out are this one, along with Parzival by Wolfram von Aschenbach. Based upon the ancient legend of the title's namesake, the Golem is set in 16th century Prague, where alchemy and occult studies were openly pursued with rigor, and tells the tale of the star child created from earth and magical will by the master alchemist, so as to go out into the world and do his bidding. This myth is, of course, the origin of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was adapted to film in 1920, during the height of the incredible period of German Expressionism in film, by Paul Wegener, who wrote the screenplay as well as directed and stars as the title character. Now, Paul Wegener has an amazing true life story as well, having shunned the Nazi movement when they later rose to power and actively hid Jewish people from the terror that sought them all at that time. This movie, of course, is also the origin of the borrowing of its title character's name for The Lord of the Rings. Wegener certainly knows what he's doing with clever, slow transitions and overlays of symbols with landscapes, as well as human figures. This is a strong, standout piece of work in its relatively short-lived genre as it relates to filmmaking. Akin to the short life of German Expressionism in film was the Czech New Wave of the late 1960s and early 1970s. This represented a small window through which the people of Czechoslovakia, as it then was called, released a burst of hitherto suppressed creativity with a unique flavor of dreamy psychedelia. Through this window, we glimpse the timely oddity called Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, made in 1970 and dividing audiences ever since. Like the 1984 film The Company of Wolves, which I reviewed in my Rare, Obscure, and Forgotten Films video, this one is entirely constructed around sexual allegory. In fact, I hope the viewer will indulge my speaking of this one as if it were a person. This movie is a hypocrite, but perhaps that's part of its intention. It purports to criticize the erotically charged male gaze, all while the camera is doing precisely that throughout the experience, caressing the form of its 13-year-old lead actress. Somehow, though, it never feels exploitative and carries its thoroughly mythical quality to the very last frame. It's permeated with symbolism, not just that related to a girl becoming a woman, but everything does build upon that as a foundation. Considering the poetic flow of dream logic going on here, It would be pointless to try to explain any plot, being that there isn't one. Suffice to say, we have Valerie on the cusp of womanhood. A thief, a sinister priest, isn't there always one of those? And a would-be lover who alternates masks. The soundtrack is simply wonderful and represents exactly the kind of thing I miss from this time period, an era which will never reproduce itself. Don't go into this one expecting linear storytelling, because you will not get that in any form. This is very simply like dreaming, and then trying to recall that dream upon waking. All in all, very much in line with what myths have always intended to convey, messages and meanings which the listener and viewer will get as much from as they found themselves giving to. And that will be the only time I end a sentence with a preposition. Very much in the same spirit of The Green Knight, the year 1979 gave us the Russian masterpiece from director and visual artist Andrei Tarkovsky called Stalker. This is very much a slow burn and quite simply requires patience. We meet our central title character, whom everyone actually refers to as Stalker. This name is actually a title conferred upon several people, we are almost immediately given to understand, who know the way to a mysterious place called the Zone. It's a place where your true will and heart's deepest desires become manifest. The problem, of course, is that most people do not know what that is. They think they know themselves and become impatient and frustrated with anyone who even suggests otherwise. So, the danger a person confronts upon arrival in the Zone is that you may not like what you discover about yourself upon arrival. One's ego is likely to be bruised and offended, and then the person becomes apt to run from the discovery and hide in denial and self-imposed ignorance. One morning, our present stalker attempts to sneak out of the house while his wife and daughter are asleep, but his wife awakens and berates him for putting his home life aside so casually when people approach him. He meets up with two of them to make the journey and informs them that it's best not to use real names, and so they refer to each other by what they do for a living. This gives us the three travelers: Stalker, Professor, and Writer. Each represents a different way of thinking. Stalker is both leader and fool, living half in this world and half in another. Writer seeks the inspiration he's lost. Professor, despite being a scientist, doesn't seem to know what questions to ask, despite questions being the driving force for all science and philosophy. The central theme here is thought forms, and shapes dominate the imagery throughout. At first, all is angular with many square and rectangular structures, but as our three new companions leave the everyday world to venture into the unknown, which will prove to be also their own subconscious selves, the shapes become curvatures and ultimately fully circular. Can we really ever know what we truly want, what our true purpose is, and will knowing that cause us to wish we'd never asked? Or will it leave us exactly where we started, but with a new perspective? I must remain intentionally vague in discussing this wonderful movie in order to respect and allow it to work its magic upon those who've not yet seen it. I will say, however, that the occultism at the heart of this movie works much like the Zone itself. You may not see it as outright symbols for those paying attention to all the details in the environment that we're brought into, but you will experience it as thought forms, having become a fellow traveler. I end this segment by saying that this movie has one of the greatest final shots in cinematic history. I mean that. And I hope you're enticed to find and experience it for yourself. The Neon Demon from 2016 seemed to come out of nowhere. This is another one that seems to keep dividing audiences, with half of its viewers feeling they'd been hit over the head with a hammer, as the movie nails in its overall point of the evil underbelly of the fashion industry. The rest of us, however, appreciated the occult language being expressed by a writer and director who obviously understands it. The amazing thing this movie accomplishes is in perpetually showing beauty and ugliness together, sometimes as partners, sometimes bitter enemies, sometimes one overtaking and redesigning the other, and sometimes one seeking to present the other in its own terms. The use of color is really intriguing. I do understand why some either dislike or even hate this film, but sometimes we need to be taken through territory that we already know or where we've already been, perhaps even multiple times already, in order to see certain new things we couldn't have last time around. I don't mean in rewatching the film. You'll know if you love or hate it by the halfway point. No, I mean when certain ground is recovered in the initial experience. There really is an evil in such industries that people involved in it will actively help to sweep under the rug so that they will not be personally held accountable for any of it, but also to keep the steady paychecks coming. Look at what's going on today with the Epstein and Maxwell case, or the Sultan of Brunei and his brother, who paid off modeling agencies to send them women and girls to drug and abuse, knowing that no one would dare to legally come after them. There's a very intense moment somewhere in the middle of this movie, truly at the heart of it in other respects too, when Elle Fanning's main character is walking toward a bright blue inverted triangle, when she comes to realize her full power as a woman. And she knew that she was a girl until she watched that symbol and walked willfully toward and into it. The symbol is, of course, the elemental sign of water, as well as that of femininity. I will say no more of actual symbols or how enacting an entire scene can be a single symbol, but simply say to you, go see it for yourself. It's also fun to see Keanu Reeves as a sleazy side character. Certainly the most unusual thing Peter Sellers has ever done, the movie called Being There from 1979 gets even stranger and more intriguing upon multiple viewings, especially in knowing its potential relationship with Stanley Kubrick in his film from 11 years prior, 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you want to see a movie based entirely around the idea of the fool of the tarot suddenly awaking to present reality, seeming to others to be equal parts genius and idiot, look no further. Peter Sellers plays a character named Chance Gardiner, and even fellow characters laugh while remarking upon this. So, your name is Gardner, and you actually are a gardener? Yes, he is. He's also the butler for a very rich old man who's just died, leaving him alone in the house. Lawyers and estate handlers and insurance representatives come over and explain to him that everything will be sold and he will have to leave immediately. He doesn't understand the concept of leaving. All he knows is gardening, caring for the house, caring for the old man, and watching television in whatever leftover time there is. There are some ultra creepy suggestions about the world we live in and the shady dealings that maintain it, things we all suspect and on some level know. All the more weird to behold such stuff in a film which is otherwise so calmly amusing as we watch people try to understand Chance's eccentric behavior. You'll find much in common with Forrest Gump here as he casually finds his way into the White House, into being considered a wise philosophical teacher, and never seeming to get how others view him, but accidentally inspiring them. Pay special attention to the final scene during a funeral. Don't worry, it's not chances. I'm not giving anything away in saying that. But the way that a group of pallbearers discuss what's happened and what to do now, all while carrying the coffin toward the eye in the pyramid. There are multiple scenes where you can really feel something subversive happening. One is at the start, where Chance makes a Masonic reference when first visited out in the garden. Another is when he first steps out into the modern world and hears a disco version of the music from 2001: A Space Odyssey, while seeing himself reflected in televisions for sale in a shop window. The rest is for you to discover. If I were to make a list of top 10 favorite films of all time, Pan's Labyrinth would certainly be in it, and it would be the only film in that list which was made after the turn of the millennium. This is simply a perfect movie in every regard. Writing, casting, directing, special effects, set design, costume design, and the music. And of course, the beautiful fluidity of stories within stories told from a historical setting. Reality and fantasy coexisting. Almost everything that director Guillermo del Toro touches turns to gold. This one, from 2005, is just dripping with intensity and atmosphere. A young girl named Ophelia is en route to the estate of her mother's new husband during the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s. She immediately feels a welcoming presence in the natural wonders and woods of the surrounding environment and makes a few acquaintances. We, the audience, also make a few acquaintances as we're brought into Ophelia's fantasized version of the events unfolding around her. This movie does the very thing I always intend to do here on my channel. Share and enliven the spirit of mythology in storytelling and personal experience. The soundtrack has a recurring leitmotif, and one particular variation of the melody is likely to haunt you long after the movie's end, and I mean haunt in a very welcome and warming way. I know people who hate this movie, and there are aspects of it which I found myself hating too. Not nearly as much as I felt other things, though, most having to do with all the usual things that director Christopher Nolan does to his audience. Insist that they become an active participant in his films, and cause us to want to put the puzzle together. Tenet, released when the pandemic had become worldwide, is a dense piece of work, to put it mildly. Perhaps the greatest annoyance with it is its sound design. Now, in writing this thing, he knows we're watching for clues and listening intently to dialogue, yet he intentionally softens and speeds up dialogue just as we most need to hear and understand it, or as background sounds begin to finally fade away during a conversation, suddenly the soundtrack will bombard us with ultra-modern club music. Folks, I recommend turning on the subtitles for this. That will make all the difference. What Nolan is doing here is forming a circular story around the concept of the Sator Square. You should look it up for an idea of the concept you're in for with this film. But I will add that I went as in-depth as you can get into it in my Essence of Tarot's Rota, or Wheel, video. It all involves permutations of the letters S-A-T-O-R, Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, and Rotas. It helps if you look up the Sator Square in your browser's images section. The word for number 10 can be seen reaching out 4 times in 4 ways as a cross centered in the square. Sator, as a name, is the movie's antagonist and can also be seen as Saturn. In character with Saturn's mythological aspects, he is here seen to be cold and calculating with slow body language. Just remember the 5 words associated with the square, because even when you don't hear them openly or directly discussed, they are all crucial in relation to one another. And how sometimes when something's going backwards, it's actually happening forward. Sound confusing? Wait till you see the movie. I'm not trying to drive you away from it, just want you to know what you're in for. As for myself, I knew with a frustrated smile by the end that I would be seeing it again, and again, and again. Ellipsis. From 1981, we have an exciting and extremely unique animated Hungarian film based on a legend of that culture. This is folk art in motion. I find it fascinating and commendable that writer-director Marcel Jankovics chose to intentionally avoid using black contour lines in the artwork, being that he felt these always made animated characters stand out from the background, whereas he was seeking to unify environment and character art. His consultants all told him that was a bad idea, and after the movie failed to do well at the box office, it was frequently claimed that that was the reason. As it rightfully and succinctly states on this movie's Internet Movie Database page, quote, "In this dreamlike Hungarian folk myth, a horse goddess gives birth to 3 powerful brothers who set out into the underworld to save 3 princesses from 3 evil dragons and reclaim their ancestors' lost kingdom." End quote. Do I even need to say any more? As of the year 2021, turning into 2022, this one is available on Canopy.com. I'm going to do something here that, in most other films, I would never. I'm going to give you a spoiler, but it's one which I firmly believe will benefit you in knowing ahead of time, something which is never overtly revealed in the movie or even spoon-fed without words. As we talk further about it, I'll also explain why I do so, particularly for my audience. There are still people who hear about the movie's creator stating his inspiration for it who claim, "I never got that when watching." Some of them even roll their eyes at those who talk about this, saying we're reading too much into it. Basically, everything you really need to know about Mother is given away in glancing at the character names in its credits. Derenkowski, the genius writer and director of this movie, has put Mother Earth, essentially any Earth goddess you could name, into the same narrative as the God of the Old Testament. Jennifer Lawrence plays the title character, and Javier Bardem plays the biblical God. I'm not going to name him here for multiple reasons. There are other biblical characters showing up in this story representing Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and then, very broadly speaking, any given congregation of fundamentalist followers of that God who have anger and hatred that they must project upon the lovers of the Mother and what she is and what she represents. The two do not belong in the same household or story, as it were, but here they are, to show us the inevitable tragic drama that plays out forever when the insane ego and self-proclaimed jealousy of that God continues to abuse her and shepherd his followers into abusing her and shepherd them into shepherding each other to abuse her. The whole thing is an incredibly emotional and ultimately satisfying allegory, delivered as a warning to everyone alive that we really must collectively honor her, else suffer unimaginably. The great irony of it all, however, is that even if humanity at large chooses to keep on our current path of abusing her, she will continue loving us and seeking to embrace us with understanding, even as she is being beaten and trampled. I will leave it at that, but to say, trust me. I further recommend Aronofsky's other films, The Fountain, Black Swan, even his very first, Pi. Actually, I recommend pretty much everything he's done other than Noah. I don't know what happened with that movie. I feel like he owed a favor to some production company and made the movie Noah. It just feels really out of character considering his other work. I've always wished a particular subgenre of movies was far more popular than it is, and the fact that only about 1 out of every 10 horror comedies are good would change. My favorites come from the 1980s, including Evil Dead 2, Phantasm 2, Spookies, and this one, The Lair of the White Worm. This was based on a book by famed Irish author Bram Stoker, who also brought us the Dracula novel upon which so many movies have been based. The book was published in 1911, just 1 year before he died, and was illustrated by Pamela Colman Smith, the woman who had just illustrated what would become the most popular tarot deck of the century. Actually, she and Bram Stoker had a history together of fellow stagecraft and set design for plays, and she used to call him Uncle Brammy, but that's another story. This film version was adapted by controversial weirdo Ken Russell and stars a very young Hugh Grant, just on the cusp of worldwide fame. And half the reason to see this unusual bit of creepy fun is the gleeful, tongue-in-cheek performance of Amanda Donohoe. She is having so much fun playing a high society heiress who also happens to be a vampiric human snake looking to resurrect a god called Dionin. The tale of St. George and the Dragon is played upon, and there's a genuinely intriguing investigation of an archaeological find. Some of the ideas presented, especially in the graphic and visceral dream sequences, are truly evil. So this comes with a warning for thoroughly adult material, some of which is sexual. There will be no missing the occult symbolism that permeates this movie, and the whole experience is almost a hypnotic one, just as Amanda Donohoe's central character would have it. By the way, if you enjoy this movie, and it then seems that her presence was just too magnetic, find a movie called The Rainbow. That's the very next thing she did, alongside a co-star from this movie and also directed by Ken Russell. Beauty and the Beast. I am talking about the French version made in 1946 by French filmmaker, poet, and fellow occultist Jean Cocteau. I will keep this one extremely simple by giving you this one summarized statement to express everything that I could possibly want in trying to get others to experience this magical film. Imagine dreaming the story of Beauty and the Beast. Well, that's precisely what you're in for, and I can virtually guarantee you'll finish it inspired to pursue creativity in as many ways as possible. Really, I'm leaving it that simple for this one. Just go dive into the mystery of the greatest version to date of this timeless story. This isn't the first film based in the Grail lore of medieval Arthurian romance, and it won't be the last. Excalibur was released in 1981 to mixed reviews and a whole lot of people going home scratching their heads. It felt like different scenes from those stories loosely strung together, but for character arcs and running themes, there seemed to be too much going on, while ironically, much time was spent in seemingly trivial scenes. I was among those slightly confused when I first saw this at that time. Of course, I was only 11 years old and only superficially familiar with the medieval literature and even read it quickly style retelling of the relative myths. Fast forward to 40 years later, when I'm smiling at director John Boorman for even wanting to do this movie. He gets it. There's a scene near the end which summarizes his understanding of the Christianized makeover of arcane knowledge and pagan mysticism, and perhaps most importantly, zodiacal cycles. When King Arthur lies ashore dying of his wounds, and the young and virile knight Percival stands above him, offering to return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake, when you see the setting sun perfectly encircled behind Arthur's bleeding head, Percival is the fool who simply acts without consideration of political discrepancy or of warnings given or of intimidation from those who claim that there's only one way of doing something, the way they've done it, and are now telling you to do it, and without even the ability to take seriously any presumptuous condescension tossed his way. Humbled along his journey, only a pure heart with true will can replace the king. There's too much to go into here, but the casting is great. Watch for Patrick Stewart in a performance that now seems to have set the standard for all his future performances. Also, as fellow Knights of the Round Table, you can see a very young Gabriel Byrne and Liam Neeson. Helen Mirren plays the witch Morgana. The use of Wagner's music from the Ring Cycle is absolutely epic and is right at home. On par with the very same theme of fool becoming king to win the Grail, as well as right in line specifically with the Arthurian romances, comes The Fisher King, from Monty Python alumnus Terry Gilliam. This was his first American production, even though Gilliam himself is American. He had been working till then with British production companies. Consider this story a thoroughly modern retelling of the last story we just reviewed, at least as modern as 1991 can be. Jeff Bridges, always lovable, plays a self-absorbed radio host who's effectively stuck in stagnant water and needs an outside force to whimsically challenge him out of his egotistical stultification. And that outside force comes in the form of Robin Williams as a bum. Essentially, the radio host is the Fisher King, or Arthur, and the bum is the fool Percival, who is the rightful heir to kingship, despite not yet knowing it. Actually, the Robin Williams character is named Perry, which of course is a play on the name of Percival. What's more, he believes himself to be a knight on a quest from the very start. So, of course, everyone thinks he's crazy. Whatever he thinks or believes or says, we realize that his motives are pure and true. And he deserves what he's after. And he's after love itself. True, actual, real love that most adults who don't have themselves like to chide others for going after and treat as if a childish fancy that will pass in time if only they would wise up. But the wise fool always finds a way. And almost always that way will be an unpredictable and whimsical one. The radio host, Jack, realizes he can redeem himself by helping Perry, having felt the twinges of care and hope in his presence. These kinds of classical tales do not usually translate well to modern settings with modern characters, but here's a rare instance when it does. There's even a beautiful scene when Perry describes to Jack a scene from the King Arthur story, unwittingly describing the very scene they are in. Now, on the subject of the Fisher King, I want to also mention to you another film from the same director, Terry Gilliam, called The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. I could explain the very simplistic plot, but doing so would seem to me to do the movie a great disservice. You can call this meta, very self-aware, but it does not indulge in that. There's a traveling band of actors who put on public plays, one of whom is dressed as the god Mercury. There's the troop leader's daughter, who's become the subject of a bet with the devil. There's also Heath Ledger's final performance as a mysterious stranger who arrives in time to be viewed as a hero. But is he? Well, one thing's certain, he is a representation of the hanged man of the tarot. 3 other actors stepped in to finish up the parts Heath did not get to finish due to his untimely death. Yet the final product with those others never feels contrived. In fact, it all works very well in tune with where the story had been bringing us. Those actors who took over were Johnny Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell. There is also the character of Dr. Parnassus himself, the leader and driving force of the traveling players. His name, of course, is from Greek mythology and means the abiding place of poetry and home of the poets. It seems the gateway to the ancient mysteries is behind the curtain of the play, and where you go and how you go may just depend upon which play is being given. Maya Derenkowski was a Ukrainian socialist who moved with her family to Syracuse, New York, as a result of her father's unpopular sympathies from Leon Trotsky. Upon arrival, he shortened the family's surname to Deren. In the early 1940s, she bought a 16mm Bolex camera with which she made her first and what would turn out to be her best-known film, Meshes of the Afternoon, in 1943. That film is recognized worldwide as a seminal avant-garde film, which at the time was filmed to be silent, but by her third marriage to Teiji Ito, 9 years later, he composed music for it, which is what we hear in most available versions today. In 1947, she won the Grand Prix International for 16mm experimental film. She gave lectures about film theory and voodoo. She wrote, directed, edited, and acted in her own films. And she filmed hours of voodoo rituals, participated in them, and ultimately adopted it as her own religion. Sadly, she had been taking amphetamines throughout her film career, prescribed by her doctor, who later lost his medical license for malpractice after she died of a brain hemorrhage as a result of all this. Her films speak for themselves, and each are intended to be experienced for the audience to sink into them and simmer like tea. As of the recording of this video, each of her films are readily available on YouTube. Perhaps a good starting point for Maya's films is Ritual in Transfigured Time from 1946. Take an unexpected trip back in time and give this fine artist your time. Not just because female directors were hard to come by 70 plus years ago, but because the very term avant-garde is an honor she held almost solitarily. This woman openly despised creatively bankrupt Hollywood, and it shows. A huge thank you to her for that. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world is more full of weeping than you can understand. This is the softly intoned introductory invitation we are given in Song of the Sea, an Oscar-nominated Celtic-flavored animated film from 2014, which is among the most beautiful and emotionally satisfying things I have ever seen. A vague similarity it has with Mother, reviewed earlier in this video, is a traditional, though modern biblical presence, standing in stark contrast to the natural grace of the film's environment. Here, that is the character of the grandmother who sings church hymns and expects that alone to be a fulfilling venture into religious fervor for her grandchildren. Steeped in ancient Irish myth, Song of the Sea follows Ben and Saoirse, a brother and sister who find that they must leave home. You see, Saoirse is a Selkie, a figure who could transform into a seal. Ben is helping her to retrieve her Selkie coat so that she can sing a very special song which will free the fairy folk who are trapped by a certain goddess. The struggle is all the more formidable being that she is mute. The dark goddess standing in their way steals emotions from the fairy folk, those who live in the magical world. The Triskele is shown to be the special triplicate symbol that it is, and we can glimpse it in rising smoke and sea spray. The movie is ultimately teaching us about repressing emotion and how that can only inevitably transform into sorrowful regret. This is one for the whole family, and I can promise you will not only never forget it, but will be pleading with your friends and family to treat themselves to it as soon as possible. This is perhaps the perfect place to end the video with the mention of Song of the Sea for the whole family. But first, some brief honorable mentions which belong in this list, but which I've also already reviewed elsewhere. Those are Eyes Wide Shut. I made a long feature-length review of this movie, both pointing out the latent occultism on display, as well as speculating on the potential meaning of certain shots and scenes. The other is Holy Mountain, also to be seen in my Rare, Obscure, and Forgotten Films video. I've mentioned that like 3 times now. Really, though, you should, of all my reviews, I recommend that one a lot. The other one is Holy Mountain from director, I'm going to pronounce it correctly this time, Alejandro Jodorowsky. This one, I discussed in that video. So I shouldn't go through them again. Just remember the titles. Holy Mountain, Eyes Wide Shut. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Thank you for all the love on these videos. I'm happy to be here 10 years later. I hope I've got a lot more things coming for you a lot more often. Take care of yourselves.